Good morning, everyone. My name is Ruth Wisher. It's my very great pleasure to be chairing this event at the Wigtown Book Festival. And our guest at Wigtown today is a man who was born and brought up in what we must now think of as the People's Republic of Kent. And if they become inadvertently attached to Europe, I might ask for political asylum. He is a man whose connections with that county long post-date his childhood and education, however, having spent a short time, courtesy of the National Trust, as the writer-in-residence for the White Cliffs of Dover, a post not without hazard, especially if you've got no head for heights. More pertinently, he's an author of more than 20 books, and being editor and co-founder of Philosophy magazine, he has perhaps done more than anybody else to demythologise that discipline. His new book, The Godless Gospel, and I have it right here, is an examination of the teachings of Jesus and their contemporary relevance, followed by a retelling of 4 of the Gospels, which strips them of all miracles, magic, and superstitions. In self-describing his belief system, he prefers the terms heathen to atheist, and he once provided a manifesto for heathens, although this, unlike the Bible's, ran to 12 rather than 10 behavioural recommendations, which were not, of course, commandments. I rather like the passage in it which said, "Our commitment to independent thought and the provisionality of belief means that few heathens are likely to agree completely with this manifesto. It's therefore almost a precondition of supporting it that you don't entirely support it." He's a man who thinks, therefore he is. Let's welcome the people's philosopher, Julian Baggini.
Thank you, Ruth. That was a very lovely introduction.
You're welcome. Let's just start, if we may, Julian, with the subtitle of the book. You're saying in the book, was Jesus a great moral teacher? Well, let's just throw that back at you. Was he?
I think he was a very interesting moral teacher. The reason why I wanted to ask that question was that so many people seem to assume the answer is yes, even when they don't have any belief that he was the Son of God or the Messiah. I mean, our culture now is largely secular, and even a lot of people who would tick a box saying Christian don't really believe Jesus was divine or rose from the dead. And yet even someone like Richard Dawkins has said that he thinks Jesus was a great moral teacher. And I guess over the years I was somewhat skeptical about that, because, and I was certainly skeptical about what people meant by that, because what did people even think the moral teaching was? Love thy neighbour, do unto others. And these things aren't particularly distinctive, and they do also risk sounding platitudinous. But I thought, as a thought experiment almost, let's imagine Jesus wasn't the Son of God, as most people assume he wasn't. The only records we have of what he said are in the Gospels. So we have to assume all the miracles and everything are just things that are added. And the closest we could get to any kind of teaching is what's left. And if you examine that, what do you get? So as a long way to answer your question, I found that when I spoke to a lot of Christians and theologians, because I wanted to make sure I was being fair to this Jesus, what surprised me was how many of them said that you do not get a complete moral system in the Gospels. Jesus isn't offering that. He comes from a certain tradition where there are laws and practices, and most of these things are taken for granted. He's there essentially to challenge the tradition, to shake things up, and to supplement it. And I think that role is something he can still play for us in a secular society. So he doesn't give us a complete system to live by, but he gives us a lot of very, very interesting and powerful moral challenges, things which tell us, don't be complacent, watch out, try harder, and so forth.
Yeah, it's interesting because I picked up quite early on reading the book about the fact that you thought the use of parables was an illustration, in fact, of the fact that he wasn't giving us a sort of set of codes to live by, because he was inviting you, by telling you stories, to, in effect, finish the story for yourself, come to your own conclusion about it.
Yeah, I think that's true, because there's another problem with thinking of Jesus as a moral philosopher is that, the way he talks is not the way in which we'd associate with a moral philosopher. He doesn't give you the reasons to do things. He doesn't do things systematically. A lot of it is, well, there are 2 key things, actually. I think one is example. Now, again, if you go outside of the Western tradition in particular, I think, and modern Western tradition, the idea that morality is taught primarily by example is not at all a strange one. In fact, it would be a very natural one. And indeed, sort of outside of academia, outside of seminars, that's what most people think as well. When people are asked, where do you get your moral values from? The most common answer is from my parents or from my community. So he has that moral example. But the thing about the parables is, there's a very popular way of arguing in moral philosophy, which is by kind of thought experiment, is to say, look, here's a situation. Imagine what you're doing in that situation. And you're invited to kind of reach a conclusion. Well, the right thing to do is X. And from that, you draw out the general principle, the general conclusion. And that's exactly how Jesus uses the parables. They're particular stories which then force you to, for yourself, conclude what the moral of the story is. And then the conclusion is, well, go away and follow that principle then.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of stuff about where he is quite, where you've drawn quite particular conclusions yourself, though, not least in relation to poverty. I mean, you're saying that, if you're morally comfortable with material comfort, then you're going down the wrong path. And that comes straight from one of Jesus' teachings, I suppose.
Well, from his point of view, I mean, I don't entirely endorse the teachings. I think they're very interesting. As I say, I think they're very important challenges, but I don't buy it 100%. But I think that if you were to look at what Jesus says about wealth and poverty, I mean, I don't think there could be any serious doubt that he is recommending a very, very ascetic life. Now, there are extremes of this. Compared to some extremes, compared to John the Baptist, Jesus is modest. He's prepared to drink wine. He's prepared, if someone does turn up with fine ointments to anoint him with, he's not going to refuse that. But the core of the teaching is very much give away your worldly goods, strip away all of that stuff, focus on what matters, and don't worry about the material. And that message is hammered home so repeatedly, it's kind of a bit mystifying how anyone who claims to be a Christian could think he said anything else. Now, of course, in contemporary Christianity, you've actually got the total extreme of this, what's called the prosperity gospel, particularly popular in North America, which which picks out those verses which say things like, he whose last will be first, and ask and it shall be given, and to the righteous everything shall be given in abundance, as some kind of the moral of the story being that if you do the right thing, you'll be rewarded materially.
No, I think that in America, it's more, if you do the right thing, please send us your money.
Yeah, well, that's true. But by sending the money, you'll get, Jesus, God will make sure there's a kind of karmic reward for that. I mean, that seems to me the most extraordinary cherry picking, because in all those passages where Jesus talks about how you will be rewarded, how you ask and it will be given, it's very clear he's talking about the rewards that matter in life, the spiritual rewards and so forth. He is so consistent in being opposed to wealth that it seems astonishing that anyone could turn around and claim otherwise, frankly. But again...
Yeah, it's odd, isn't it, that they always seem to skip over the bit about the rich man going to heaven being more difficult than the camel going through the eye of a needle. You never find that somehow or other in all of these televised pastoral messages.
No, extraordinary. It is extraordinary. But I think also one has to recognise that the very fact that the stories are somewhat opaque, it does require interpretation, and there are ambiguities. It's that infinite possibility of interpretation, which I think is one of the reasons why Christianity became such a powerful religion over the centuries. It could keep being reinvented to suit the times. And so it could be the religion of the oppressed and the downtrodden. It could also be the official religion of the Roman Empire or of the kings and queens of Europe. And that kind of ability for people to be able to essentially take the Jesus they like to fit their own agenda has made it very flexible.
Cherry pick the gospel passages. I wonder if that is also, though, but I mean, you're saying that the ability to reinterpret these gospels is what has kept Christianity going in so many different cultures. I wonder, though, if it's also the reason for so many different Christian schisms.
Well, yeah, I think that's true too. I mean, when you look at the schisms, a lot of the time, I think a lot of historians would say that people pay too much attention to the theology, and it's often about politics and power. So if you take the first major one between the Orthodox Church and Rome, it's officially about this thing called filioque clause, which is essentially, it's very hard to get your head around, particularly if you're not steeped in this stuff, but it's whether the Son proceeds from the Father or it's what proceeds from what in the Trinity of the Father, Son and Holy Spirit. It seems to be a very, very specific theological matter. And I think most historians say, Well, okay, that's what it was officially about, but really it was about where the seat of power was. That's what it was essentially knocking on about. So I think a lot of the schisms are explained by that, but not all of them. I mean, I think that if you reduce it purely to politics, you're not taking faith and religion seriously enough. The Protestant Reformation was certainly largely a revolt against the power of Rome. But as I understand it, part of the critique of Rome having that power was that in having that power, it was departing from the teachings of the true gospel. So there's always a theological underpinning to these things.
You make the point, or rather you ask the question in the book as to whether Jesus could reasonably be described as a socialist or whether he could be reasonably described as entirely apolitical. So where are you in that?
Yeah, I find that very, very interesting. I mean, this is something that I didn't ultimately change my mind about reading the book. I always thought that the idea that Jesus was a proto-socialist was anachronistic. It seems that he was just not interested in changing the political structures of society. That wasn't his mission. And I think that what happened when I wrote the book was I became even more convinced of that, because it became more and more evident that there was a clear focus, if you like, to his teaching. And that's this idea of metanoia, which is the change of heart and mind. Time and again, what it comes back to is the idea that the most important thing is to transform yourself, to make yourself purer, to make yourself a better person. That's why poverty doesn't matter if you're poor, and that's why being wealthy is a problem, because having wealth means that where your wealth is, there your heart will be also, that it detracts you from that true path. But it's also why politics is also a distraction, because actually, you can change the structures of society all you like, but you should be focusing on changing yourself. Now, again, that's one aspect where I don't totally go along with him, not because I'm a full-blooded socialist, but because for me, ultimately, the problem with Jesus as a complete package is that he is, for me, too not of this world. He's really saying that his emphasis on inner purity and so forth is so austere that I don't think he has enough time for what, as a humanist, I'd talk of the joys of being alive, the pleasures of the body, of the flesh, and so forth. But nonetheless, I think it's important to have that as a counterpoint, because I think we should be trying to make political changes to improve the lot of everybody. That's true. But our culture doesn't really have enough emphasis on the importance of changing yourself too. It's like, we think that it's all about the politics, get the politics right. And then what do? Well, we get on and enjoy life. Well, actually, I think there's a deeper challenge to work on oneself.
You come back quite a lot in the book to metanoia, to changing yourself, to making yourself a better person, and indeed on the emphasis on trying to be good in yourself rather than worrying about other people being bad, as it were. But that seems to me almost a more Buddhist approach than a Christian one.
Well, it's interesting you make that connection. A lot of people do make that connection. But I think, and there is, some people will speculate, when you do a book like this, by the way, you open yourself up to a whole world of theories, because there are so many theories about what Jesus actually did or didn't do. There's one theory that, in his missing years, he went to India and he came back with his Indian teachings. But actually, there's a lot more that's closer to home. There's a very good book, and I won't remember off the top of my head the name of it. I think it's called Jesus as Philosopher, and it's really looking at the striking similarities between a lot of what he says and what's actually quite common in the Greco-Roman world. In thinkers like the Stoics, for example. So the idea of work on the self, of a detachment from worldly values and so forth, you don't have to go as far as India to find those things in Jesus's time. You have them there in Greece and Rome.
Some of the conversations you've had with Christians, with committed Christians, struck me as very interesting, because they seem to be saying almost that you couldn't really achieve what you wanted to achieve, and even in terms of personal satisfaction, without a belief in some divinity. And that also, if there wasn't a divinity, if there wasn't the grace of God, basically what's in it for secular? Yeah,
I think that's a very good question. Now, I mean, I think this is where, in a way, I have it both ways. a sense, because I think there's a lot to be said for Jesus as a moral teacher if you don't believe he was a son of God. But at the same time, I think there's no denying that you take away the divinity and you lose something. It's not the same. You can't keep the same Jesus without any sense of his divinity. And I think what you really lose is that hope of ultimate resolution, ultimate salvation. Although I do think it's quite ambiguous, even in the Gospels with the miracles, about what that really means, whether it does mean some heaven. We might come to that later. But what the faith gives you, what the idea of the divinity gives you, is that in this imperfect life where so many things go wrong, there is a hope of a help that is stronger than us, that can sort of carry us through. I think if you take that away from Jesus's teaching, then you have a gloomier vision. I think this is true, though, of all honest secular ethics. Take away God and everything. I mean, I didn't like that advertisement on the side of buses in London a few years ago, where it said there's probably no God. That was a good start for a slogan because it said probably, it wasn't being dogmatic. The second part said, so stop worrying and enjoy your life. And I think, well, that's just too glib, isn't it? There are lots of people for whom life it's been nothing but struggle. There are people who have died young. There are people who are bereaved. There's lots of times where life goes wrong. And without that belief in the divine, there's nothing that's going to ultimately make it right. So I think we are left with a much bleaker vision without it. But I think, to me, that's a realistic vision, and we have to accept that.
Yeah, I was going to say, you've signed up to that bleaker vision, obviously, as a heathen rather than an atheist, and we'll come back to that in a minute as well. But interestingly, when you were talking about the difficulty of defining goodness, you said, well, it's just like love, or it's like beauty. You know, you're not going to find it in a physics book. There's no obvious definition. Nevertheless, it exists palpably. And you could probably say the same about faith. I mean, to people of faith, they will say to you and to me as a fellow heathen, they will say, well, you know, we can't explain faith, but trust me, if you have it, it matters.
Well, that's fine. I think this is a tricky one because obviously faith means different things to different people. And I think there's a kind of a difference between a kind of faith which is honest and open about mystery and uncertainty, and the kind of faith which basically uses that kind of argument to be slippery and evasive. So let's put it this way. If someone were to say, listen, I'm a Christian, maybe I'm specifically a Christian, I can't really make sense in normal terms about what it means for someone to be the son of God and to rise from the dead and for heaven. I accept these are ways of speaking, but they touch me in some kind of way, and they affect me in some kind of way. And for me, I feel there is a reality behind them, and that's that. Now, that seems to me, I don't agree with that, but it seems to me honest, and it seems to me kind of respectable. But a lot of the time, when people say, well, you know, you can't pin down faith, you can't define faith, alongside that, they've got a lot of beliefs which they do pin down and define very clearly. I think the example I'd give of this, which is most clear, is the empty tomb test, as I call it. I get into a lot of discussions with kind of quite intellectual, academic, religious people who will say, well, you know, the problem with you atheists is you take everything too literally, you don't accept mystery, etc., etc. And I go, fine. So, okay, so bottom line then, to you, does it matter? Is it important to you that the tomb was empty? And not the tomb was empty, not because somebody nicked the body or something like that, but because by some inexplicable miracle, the dead body of Jesus rose from the dead. And the vast majority of them say it is. So for all the talk of faith being a mystery and it's about accepting understanding, for a lot of people, it also does require a belief in something very, very specific and very, very literal. So I kind of do, yeah.
I want to stop there because I just want to read one more bit from your manifesto for heathens, which intrigued me. You said, a heathen has more in common with a sincere, rational, religious truth seeker than an atheist whose lack of belief is unquestioned or has become unquestionable. So it seems to me, reading that you, while being an atheist stroke heathen, you're really not in any way hostile to believing Christians, provided they are sufficiently open to conversation about their beliefs and about yours.
Yeah, I do. I think that's definitely true. And I've contributed to a book which is about atheist and believer dialogue. And there's a kind of a group of us who keep meeting. And I've had a lot of some of the best conversations and talks have been with very open-minded religious groups who've brought me in. I mean, I did a little book recently on Babette's Feast, the film, and that really emerged out of invited talks I was given by some Christian organisations who were very welcoming. Here's what I think why I think there's a closeness there. Forgive me if you've heard me say this before, but a lot of people say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. This is a kind of a cliche for our times. And I say the opposite. I'm not spiritual, but I'm religious. And what I mean by that is that I don't have any belief at all that there's another dimension. I think the physical world is all that there is. The physical world is remarkable, by the way, and it gives rise to things like, love, art, beauty, which are not describable by physics. So it's not just a physical world. It's a remarkable physical world, but nonetheless, no other dimension. But what I have never lost from religion is a kind of sense of seriousness, I think, about trying to work out what this is all about what it means to live. And also a seriousness which says that the reality is probably going to exceed our full understanding. That's one thing. And from a moral point of view, that the right and the good is, again, almost certainly going to exceed our capacity to follow it. Now, that's what I find really conducive in the religious. When the religious people have that.
Can I argue with you just briefly about that, if I may? Because one of the things that I find irritating about organized religion is when people are asked a question about something that's miraculous or magical, they say, oh, well, we don't understand that. That passes all human understanding. And I think, what a cop-out, what a get-out clause. And you're more or less saying the same, we can't understand everything, so just accept.
Well, no, I'm not. That's not what I'm not saying. So I agree. When it's that kind of cop-out, we don't understand, let's just accept, I don't buy that. But I think that there's a very more serious strain of being religious in which it's not just a cop-out. It's people will they'd almost be embarrassed about having any kind of belief in the things which seem to defy contemporary science. But they think that there's something in this that's capturing something important about the human condition, capturing something important about ultimate reality, maybe, and they're really not sure what. So they go along with the words, they go along with the framing, but they do understand that this is not to be taken too literally. And I think that is the bottom line. When people just say, yes, I believe Jesus healed the sick, and I don't know how, it's a mystery, end of story, I think that is a cop-out. I think that's lazy, and I think it's intellectually, I don't think it's defensible, but that's not the kind of embrace of mystery I mean. I mean, you would have spoken to many of these kind of people. We before we came on air, we were mentioning Richard Holloway, of course, who's gone on his journey from being a bishop to being an unbeliever, and is now actually almost kind of he's a kind of almost atheist Christian now, as I understand it.
Well, in fairness to Richard, he's kind of come back into the flock, but on his own terms.
Yeah, exactly, which is a great thing. But people like that with Richard. I mean, why it's such a lifelong journey for him, and why he just can't just completely give up the church, is that he finds in religion a kind of humility before the capacities of our understanding, and a humility about our moral capabilities, and a serious desire to address that. And although a lot of the particular doctrines and stories and rituals are, in a sense, almost ridiculous, they can seem ridiculous if you approach it from a purely rational point of view, it's the sense that that's the best we've got, and that when you give that up completely, then you're left with not enough. Now, I don't agree with that, but I can see that, and I can respect that.
Let me just bring that right back to you then, because you had a very religious upbringing, and you were very involved in matters religious for a very long part of your young life. Do you think there's some kind of residual pull there for you as well?
Well, I think the residual pull is not towards those beliefs. I think it's quite interesting. You go through a process of losing your faith, and at some point you look back and go, how could I ever have believed that? It's some specific things. It just seems almost nuts to you. So I don't have any sort of residual pull in that way. But I think, like I was saying earlier, what may be left as the residue is, again, I think that just that sense of wanting to take these things seriously and not wanting to overestimate our capacity as human beings to fully get it, And so, religion is, in a sense, at its best, a kind of institutionalization of that kind of radical humility, if you like. In practice, it often doesn't end up becoming that. It becomes the opposite. It becomes often about complete arrogance and doctrinal fascism almost. But at its best, it is that, I think.
You made the point too, though, that one of the people who was most hostile in his time to organized religion was Jesus, because he had no time for the kind of structural niceties and no time for in fact, not really any time for the law if the law didn't make sense. I was interested where you describe how he thinks that it's okay to break the law, if you like, for the common good, and you shouldn't get so hung up on the law brackets dogma that you went ahead with things just almost regardless of whether or not they were worthwhile.
Yeah. So one of the perils of this kind of thing is I'm now distracted by my cat who's trying to get into the room. The poor thing is used to going outside and he's being locked up because we're in temporary accommodation. So
could I just warn you then, Julian, that my dog may come in, and if he sees your cat, we're in big trouble.
Yeah. So Jesus and ecclesiastical structures. Well, I mean, this is one of those things where I find it astonishing, actually, that the route that Christianity has gone by over the years has been almost invariably towards hierarchical clerical structures with very fixed doctrines. I mean, anyone who read the Gospels with any honesty at all would recognize that Jesus was completely against that. The scribes and the Pharisees, it was awful. He said that amongst you there shall be no rabbis, you shall just be brothers. I mean, this is absolutely explicit, right? And
heresy in his day.
Yeah, exactly. And yet somehow that got turned into institutionalized religion. I find that one of the most astonishing distortions of his teachings. So it's mysterious in a sense to see how that happened, except it's not mysterious when you recognize that it seems to be something about human nature, isn't it? That any kind of system, no matter how benign, ends up turning into some kind of power structure.
Let me throw another of these contradictions at you then, because there's a lot in the book about, Jesus as a peacemaker, as a pacifist almost. And yet I live on Loch Long, where I have an uninterrupted view when I don't want it of nuclear submarines. And from time to time, there is a minister of some religion or other who go down and bless it. And I wonder in my own mind how we got from there to here as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's very interesting too. Now, I think that again, I sort of put these questions to a lot of the Christians and theologians I spoke to, and I think they were made most uncomfortable by teachings on family, by teachings on wealth, but I think ultimately on teachings about pacifism too, because again, I think it's pretty damn clear that Jesus was a pacifist. And I'm not saying he was right to be a pacifist, but I can't see any evidence at all that he was in favour of violence of any kind whatsoever. As usual, there are one or two passages which are ambiguous enough for people to make something of them if they like. At one point he said, I come not to bring peace, I come with a sword. But in context, that seems to be very, very, very clearly a metaphor. So how is it then that people turn it around? Well, there is a way of understanding this which makes some sense, but I don't ultimately buy it. The idea is this: it goes back to what we were saying right at the beginning, that Jesus didn't give us a complete moral system. He gave challenges. And also, he was operating in a very particular time, in a very particular context. So he did not give us a template for all societies in all times. Now, what people would then say is, let's fast forward a couple of thousand years. Let's go to, say, the rise of the Third Reich and the evils of Nazism. What would be most consistent with Jesus's message there, who's on the side of the poor, the weak, the powerful? Do we really think he would have said, let's stand by, let's let this happen, or not? Now, actually, I think if you look at what his teachings, I think he would have been one of those pacifists. And there were pacifists during that time. I mean, people often talk about, the rise, the Nazi Germany as like the end of the argument on pacifism. But there are people for whom it isn't the end of the argument. They accept the fact.
He would have been a conscientious objector then.
I think so, and I think he would have said, "Look, if we go down this road of fighting violence with violence, we're going to contaminate ourselves. We're going to, and what would we say about that? Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, lots of things that were done by the Allies in this fight against fascism were themselves absolutely dreadful." And I think for Jesus, awful though it would have been to stand by and see these things happen, he thought the price you pay in terms of your own goodness by getting dragged into it was too high. I don't agree, but I think that's a respectable argument.
You said in the book, and I'm quoting here now, you said we can't uproot his teaching from first century Palestine, a first century Palestine context, but we can follow its spirit rather than its letter. And I guess that's what all of the things you said this morning are, that there is an underlying message worth hearing, even if you don't want to buy the full package.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's true, and I think I wouldn't want to buy the whole package at all. But and in terms of the spirit, I mean, first of all, we've already talked about this idea that you must work on yourself. I think the other really interesting thing about Jesus's moral teaching is that it's uncompromisingly unreasonable. He says at one point, "Be thee perfect. Be thee thy perfect." Now, we can't be perfect. No one can be perfect. That's an impossible demand. And yet, what he's really saying is, it doesn't matter that it's impossible. You should still try. And if we think about that attitude, we actually tend to embrace that attitude when it comes to things like, say, sport or art. If you did an interview with a sports person and they said, "I'm always trying to play the perfect match. I never play the perfect match. There'd always be a mistake. Even, Roger Federer makes the odd mistake. But I aspire to be perfect because that is what drives me to be my best." We go, "Wow, excellent. Good for you. I really admire that. That's driven." We don't bring that same kind of commitment and seriousness to our moral lives. We don't say, "Look, I know I can never be morally perfect, but I really want to try because only by trying to be morally perfect can I be the best I can." I think that's a really good aspiration. And I think part of the problem with the secular ethics, which I feel most in tune with, people like Hume and Aristotle, who are much, much more worldly figures, is that it's very easy when following them to get sort of seduced into this idea ethics is just about living the good life. You'll be a decent person, you'll be kind, but it's about your flourishing, you can enjoy things. And it can kind of encourage a kind of complacency about the fact we live in a world of dreadful suffering, of awful things going on. And it's too easy to sit there having my very nice, farm boy brews coffee sent to me by the festival. Wonderful stuff, right? But sitting by while things are going on. By the way, you can square those circles. A company like this, by the way, will be supporting growers in Uganda, right?
So am I. Just if you've just tuned in, and I can't think why you've only just tuned in, but anyway, we're discussing Julian Bajunia's latest book, The Godless Gospel, which not only tries to extrapolate contemporary messages from Christ's teachings, but also reworks the Gospels, stripping them of the, if you like, any supernatural parts. So I just wanted to say that at this point, Julian, because you can actually buy Julian's book and you can buy it from the Wigtown Book Festival's online shop, and I would urge you so to do. And while we're on the subject of the Wigtown Book Festival, as you know, ladies and gentlemen, everything this year is free. All these online interviews that you're seeing are free. But if you happen to have the odd bit of folding money that you haven't got a good cause for, please think about donating it to the Wigtown Book Festival so that we can continue to have sessions like this in all the years to come. Here endeth my message. Let me just talk a bit about, you mentioned earlier, Julian, about heaven that we might get back to. I'd quite like to get back to heaven now, if we might, because you're suggesting, and in fact other people have too, that you don't have to believe in an extraterrestrial heaven. You can believe that the kingdom of God, however you choose to interpret it, happens here and now and attend to it here and now.
Yeah, this is true. So the phrase "the kingdom of heaven" is the what is the basilio, I think, that's used, and it's again very, very interesting. I should say my most overused phrase ever is "very interesting." I use it all the time. Interesting, I find. So the basilio, the kingdom of heaven. Now, when I was kind of taking out all the references to the supernatural and God and miracles in this editing of this hybrid godless gospel, I really had to hesitate over this phrase. And it was very interesting to me that in context, it was not only not clear that it was referring to something beyond, there were times where it explicitly wasn't. So the kingdom of heaven is within you is something Jesus tells his followers, right? He's explicitly saying it's not a place that we end up in. It's within you. It's a kind of state of being. So a state of being rather than a future state. And so I kept in those references to the kingdom of heaven as kingdom of God. And I do think that's most consistent with what is said. And even if you sort of like, if you go looking for an idea of the afterlife in the gospel, you can find it if you really want to find it, but it's really not clear. And it shouldn't be surprising either, because Jesus, of course, was a Jew, and the afterlife in Judaism doesn't have the same role that it has done in contemporary Christianity. There's not the same emphasis at all, and there's almost a kind of agnosticism about it. Even in some, I know Judaism is diverse. So I do find that very interesting, and I think that that idea that what we should be trying to establish is a kind of a state of being rather than anything else is a message which resonates for more secular ways of thinking, right? So you don't have to give up the idea of working to achieve a better state. You just have to understand it in the right way.
I want to throw in one or two other things just when you decided to do a commercial for a coffee a moment or two ago. We were talking about the fact that we can take on messages and we can proselytize without actually becoming uncomfortable in any way ourselves. And you say a lot of very interesting things about compassion, not the least of which is that it's not enough to be compassionate in the abstract. You have to be attentively compassionate. You have to actually do things. And you mentioned in that context Mother Teresa, so perhaps you could reprise that particular thought for us, because why should anyone getting into trouble?
Well, she's a controversial figure, Mother Teresa, and for some people she's untouchable in the sense that she just stands for purity and goodness and self-sacrifice. And for some people, the other spectrum, she's the Wicked Witch of the East kind of thing. And I wouldn't say that I'm confident enough to judge her completely. I wouldn't want to judge her. Jesus says I shouldn't judge anyone. Of course, I should be looking at my own sins. But if you look about the way she set up her mission, it seemed that, and a lot of witness reports here back this up. This isn't just kind of idle speculation. Her concern was primarily with people's spiritual well-being. She understood that very much in terms of, belief, prayer, all these kind of things. And then actually the medical help was secondary. A lot of the time the medical knowledge was weak, the medical training was poor. People would even abandon the patients when it was time to go and pray and so forth. And so I think that, clearly she was called, she felt some kind of calling to help the poor and the sick. But it seems to me that she was so, bound up with her particular religious viewpoint that it seemed that she wasn't actually responding with that really deeply human compassion of the physical suffering of people in the here and now. She was too fixated on something more abstract.
I'm going to stop. Can I stop there for 1 second? Because I'm going to take you back to heaven for a moment, if you'll pardon because I've got one of our audience has got a particular question about what we were talking about a moment ago, and I'd quite like to include it. It's from Stephanie. Oh, no, I've lost her. I had her. Well, if Stephanie can come back on the chat line, we'll get back to that. But carry on about Mother Teresa and compassion.
Yeah, so I think that's a good example. I think there's a lot of compassion is, we talk about empathy and we talk about compassion as being very important things. But I think that the problem with all this stuff is that if you don't examine your feelings or you don't question them, you can often end up either giving inappropriate help or responding in a way that you think is best for someone, it is not best for them. Or even sort of, I don't know, even getting too caught up with how it's making you feel and not pay attention to them. I think that real compassion requires an effort. There's a really great, I'm a great fan of the Coen brothers films, and I think that the Coen brothers do moral philosophy in their films. And in Barton Fink, this woman Audrey, who's kind of quite a cynical person in some way, says to the naive playwright who thinks he understands the common working man and doesn't at all, empathy requires understanding. It's a very simple kind of slogan, but it's so true. The problem with this young playwright is he thinks he's empathizing with the ordinary working person, but he has no understanding of their lives whatsoever, and therefore completely fails. And so I think that in this, the call to compassion and to love, it does make sense also of this somewhat mysterious injunction to love thy neighbor, because I think in our culture we think love is a feeling. How can you command yourself to love? You either love or you don't, right? Well, no, because the kind of love that Jesus is talking about is nothing. Actually, it's not really relevant what your feeling is. It's about action. It's about loving action towards people. And if you're going to act lovingly towards people, you do have to really work hard at thinking about what is in their best interest and what they really need, and not just responding to what you feel.
I'm going to throw you a couple of questions now that have come in, Julian. And Stephanie is back with me. Hello, Stephanie. She says, hi, Julian. Why do you think the human species believes if they worship, they've got a place in a heaven? Why not all the animals who are industrially slaughtered for their benefits?
Well, okay, so the animal issue is one which I think you don't really get anything from the Gospels, and in that sense, it shows
except for them being sacrificed.
Yes, that's true. Although Jesus wasn't really heavily into sacrifice. I mean, there might be a few mentions of it, but he wasn't. I mean, he was quite angry with the people selling stuff for sacrifice. He thought the whole sort of rituals of sacrifice had become a kind of a commercial operation in order to keep power for people. We had to buy the things for the sacrifice. So he actually cleared these things out. I think in that case, it's just a product of his time. Animal welfare, animal rights just wasn't on the agenda for people, just wasn't. Since then, I think it is interesting. Again, this is where the evolution, the Christianity's ability to evolve can be helpful, because people can begin to as it were, adapt the Christian framework to respond to concerns that we didn't used to have. You see this perhaps more with the environment, with animal ethics, to be honest. I think that for most mainstream religions, well, the monotheistic religions, there is a problem for animal rights as making a priority, because there is this idea that humanity was made in God's image, and that makes us special, and that therefore there's a kind of theological reason why you think there's a absolute divide between human beings and other animals. Whereas, of course,
relevant if you don't think there's a God.
If you don't think there's a God, there's a continuum. There's no heaven for any of us, but there is welfare for everything, and that therefore, there are reasons to take that into account. So I that's just a blind spot, and another example of how you just don't get a complete moral system looking at Jesus. Tells you nothing about animals.
Let me just throw a wee hand grenade in from Adrian, who says, in your opinion, would the world have been a better or a worse place had Jesus never existed?
Oof, that's so difficult, because it depends on what would have filled the void, wouldn't it?
There was a void.
Well, there would have been some kind of established system of either religion or values and ethics, and probably of religion. I think, that just would almost certainly have been the case. I mean, what's the alternative story is that Rome never became Christian, and then what happened? Because Rome would have. There are so many counterfactuals here. I wouldn't like to hesitate, but I think it's very difficult to argue that organized religion has predominantly been a force for good, unfortunately. There's a lot of good in Christianity. There are a lot of good Christians, and there's a lot of value in the Gospels.
The specific question about whether or not the world would be a better place had Jesus not existed.
Well, I think that there is nothing. I don't think there's any sort of unique contribution that Jesus makes to our thought, which makes him an indispensable figure. I think that we could have got those. You can pick up the different insights from elsewhere because he existed. But if he did exist, I mean, we don't know. To be honest, we don't know that Jesus did exist as a historical figure. Most people assume that whether or not the Gospels are accurate, there must have been an original Jesus. But actually, the evidence is very, very, very thin. So I think we just don't know. So I think the only meaningful question is, would the world have been a better place if this Christ figure had not been placed at the center of a cult which became a religion? And given that organized Christianity
has the question to suit your answer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm trying to make it. Yeah, I think I'm reluctant. Look, I'm reluctant to go. I think all I can say is it's very hard to claim that organized Christianity, as over its 2,000 years, been more of a force for good than otherwise.
Let's take another question.
Inquisitions, yeah.
Sorry, another question. I want to get as many in as I can from people who are tuning in. This is from Andy. He says, where does Julian stand on the modern idea that prophets and those who have, quotes, spiritual conversations are actually having psychiatric moments or issues?
Oh, well, that's an interesting one. I think that one's always got to be careful not to sort of, as it were, do retrospective diagnosis of people. I think there are some figures, some sort of people who've been made saints who, when you look at their experiences, did seem to be having psychotic episodes and so forth. But on the other hand, I think our understanding of these conditions is changing quite a lot. And there's some very interesting work. And again, I've forgotten the name of one of the guys who's involved in it going on at the moment about hearing voices and what that means. And the idea being that hearing voices at its extreme is very, very, is pathological and is very disturbing. But in a sense, there's a continuum of this, and that all of us hear voices. It's just that most of the time they're kind of under control. We know they're not us. We don't confuse them with this, that, and the other. And so therefore, even if it's true that some of these people may be on this spectrum whereby they think they're receiving direct messages from elsewhere, that doesn't mean that what they therefore produce as a result of that is worthless or empty. It might mean we don't want to give it the same interpretation as them. So we might say, look, you weren't talking to God, you were talking to a part of yourself, but wasn't it interesting what that part of yourself said?
There's more questions coming in, but there's one that I wanted to throw in before we get to it, which is that the church, various churches, mostly all churches in the organized sense, seem to be obsessed with sex, but Jesus wasn't.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. The family values issue is a very tricky one because it doesn't really suit anybody. If you're a liberal Christian who believes, you take a very liberal attitude towards sex and sexuality, I don't think you really find Jesus as your friend. But he was very specifically against adultery. Adultery was really, really wrong for him, more wrong than it was for the people of his time. He was strict on that than anything else. But on anything other than adultery, he's completely silent. He even with adultery, he doesn't believe in sort of condemning or punishing adulterers, right? Because if he who is without sin cast the first stone is what he says towards the people trying to judge. So in that sense, he's not into punishment. But in terms of family, it's completely against it. I mean, this is so explicit. Time and again, he says, you must turn your back on your family. You must hate your mother, hate your father. There's no pro-family message at all. And it's better not to marry. This was a really interesting thing, this. A lot of people know that St. Paul said in one of his epistles, it is better to marry than to burn, meaning that you really shouldn't marry. But if not marrying means you're going to be full of pent-up sexual energy, essentially, then you should do it. That's better than the alternative. Jesus is almost the same. His disciples say to him in a discussion, so is it then better not to wed? And he says, well, not everyone can accept this teaching, but the implication being if you can, it's better.
But you also made the point, the attendant point on that, Julian, which was interesting, which was that if he was really saying, turn your back on your family, turn your back on your relations, follow me, that there was a danger there of that being seen as a bit of a cult.
Well, yeah, I mean, these days, that's true. If people say that following me means turning back on your family, we say cult. So in that sense, he did seem to be a cult leader. But so just to complete the thought on this, I think that although he's got these conservative views on adultery and a kind of a hostility to family in general, the general point is that he says almost nothing about sex and sexuality. It's just not the most important thing. And even with even where there are sexual sins, you don't go around throwing stones at people for doing it. So the contemporary church's often obsession with sexual ethics, again, is completely out of tune with the Gospels. It shouldn't be anywhere near the top of the list of priorities. It's absurd that every time the bishops get together, it seems the debates about, gay marriage and women's ordination. Crazy.
Quite well. Let me take another question then, which is from Helen. She says, "What significance do you attach to there being 4 gospel writers (brackets with glosses added by St. Paul)?"
Well, I don't think there's any significance in that, because as we know, there were lots of gospels in circulation, and it was at a particular kind of meeting where they decided to pick 4 of them and make them the official ones. And I'm not saying that was a completely random process. They had their reasons and motivations, but there are lots and lots of gospels in circulation. Why 4? I don't know. You'd have to ask a historian about that. But I think it's very difficult. I do find it difficult for people to kind of really get to grips with just how arbitrary this Bible is. We're brought up, being told this is the word of God, and we come to believe it wasn't. But the sense there's something really special about it, it seems hard to shake off. And the idea that it's simply a collection of books and letters put together, hundreds, finely edited. So many of them were written. I think the earliest was probably 30 or 40 years after Jesus' death, and a lot of them written much longer, and then put together by a committee of people who already had their own agendas. So to treat it as having some kind of essential unity, I think is a mistake.
I always think of St. Paul as a bit of a misogynist, but that's neither here nor there. Let's take another question, which is from Tom. He says, faith is often described as a sort of comfort blanket. Does Julian have any thoughts on what humans are suffering from that requires them to need a comfort blanket?
Well, I don't think that's too mysterious. I think it's true, and I think I would tend towards that view myself, that there is, and it's quite interesting, a lot of the Christians I spoke to, when we're talking about can you have the gospel without divinity, without salvation, a lot of them, said, well, you're just left with something so bleak if you do that. You're left with no hope. And that seemed to me to be an argument for them not to go along with it. Whereas for me, that's just a necessary consequence. You have to embrace it. What we need comfort from is the idea that there is unredeemed suffering in the world. As simple as that. There is suffering, there is pain, there is loss, which there is no ultimate resolution to. That's surely something everyone must feel the burden of. And religion offers some comfort in some way. That's not the case. Ultimately, things may be put right. So I don't find it mysterious that people seek that comfort.
I'm interested too, Julian, because you talked about atheism or the confession of atheism being quite a difficult thing for lots of people still to come to terms with, and it was almost you're almost suggesting that people can still be ostracized for saying that out loud. And you told an absolutely chilling story in the book about a babysitter, so maybe you could repeat it for us.
Yeah, well, this was in America, of course, where things are behind. I mean, I did a piece on atheism in America about a decade ago now, and it was extraordinary. So this babysitter, the babysitter was a drug addict, right? A serious drug addict. Her family, nevertheless, allowed her to babysit. And they knew she was a drug addict. When they found out she was an atheist, she wasn't allowed to babysit anymore, right? Now, on the one hand, that seems absurd and ridiculous, but from their worldview, it makes perfect sense. Because what's the worst that could happen if you leave your baby with a drug addict? The worst that can happen is that the baby dies, right? But hey,
that's quite a serious consequence.
The worst that can happen if you believe in hell is that this atheist is going to pollute the mind of the baby. The baby is going to become an atheist and therefore will have eternal damnation. So it's death and reuniting with the Father versus eternal damnation. So this is the perverse logic of that version of Christianity, which is it's better that your babysitter is a drug addict than an atheist.
Let me take another question. Alistair has asked, did the church dehumanize Jesus and his message by basing salvation on a belief in the divine Christ rather than being faithful to his ethics? Richard Holloway says that this has caused a lot of cruelty.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way in which the church has developed over the years is it insisted on doctrinal orthodoxy and ritual practice and purity as being the keys. Whereas if you go back to the Gospels, it's very clear that the keys for Jesus are living well, being virtuous, and being the best person you can. So in that sense, I'd have to agree. Yeah, the church has essentially totally distorted it, and that causes all sorts of problems because people genuinely believing that it's more important to believe the right things, to recite the right creeds, to say the right prayers, than it is to do good. There's one thing on prayer in the Gospels, where he says the Lord's Prayer. How shall I pray? Say this. All the rest is about how you treat your fellow human beings, how you act, how you respond to the world. So the
secular prayer in the book.
Sorry?
You put a secular version of the Lord's Prayer in the book.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. I don't know where it is now. I can find it for you, but yeah. The secular, you strip it away. It's basically, give us maybe have our daily bread. So it's a call. Let us hope we have the necessities of life. Let me forgive people as I am forgiven. So that's really, and again, we haven't talked about forgiveness, but that's really, I think, about let us maintain good relationships between us. And deliver us from evil, and that means be on our guard against doing wrong, because it's very easy to do wrong. We think that evil people go around with horns and they're separate. They're not. Most evil things are done by ordinary people. So resist evil, forgive, restore relationships, and hope to have the basics in life. That's a very powerful little message, really.
We're running quickly out of time here, Julian, but I want to bring in, there's another Andy online now. He says, a humanist friend of mine has read the ancient Aramaic texts and attests that Jesus never actually existed. His historiography is a rehash of John the Baptist. Thoughts, he says?
Well, I'm really basically neutral on this. There's lots of stuff about, what the historical Jesus said or didn't say, or whether the historical Jesus existed. And it's interesting. It's very, very interesting. Of course it is, but that's not the route I wanted to go down. This isn't historical reconstruction of anything. I'm not claiming this is historical. It's a what if. If you believe Jesus was not the Son of God, but you believe he has something important to say, the only things we have to go on are what's in the gospel. So we have to extract from those the secular teachings and see where we are. As for whether he did it, I think again, it is interesting though that how most people still think it's quite shocking to even claim that Jesus didn't exist as a historical figure. I have no idea. I wouldn't be surprised if there was someone called Jesus that all this stuff was based on. I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't, and it was some kind of hybrid amalgam. Who knows? Shoulder shrugging.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm going to claim the last question here. I want to know if you were to give us what you thought were Jesus's top priorities as a moral teacher, what would they be?
Okay, I think it's focus on your own goodness and well-being, not on other people's. This is where non-judgment comes in. So don't go around judging people. If you see people doing wrong, then use that as a reason to ask whether you might be similar, whether you might have other errors and so forth. So first of all, work on cultivating your own goodness. Work on healing relationships that are broken. That's what forgiveness is all about, essentially, I think. And I do think there is this thing about, do not become overburdened with what are ultimately trivial worldly concerns. And in the kind of developed society we have today in the West, where even the relatively poor have much, much more than most people in history could have imagined, it's very difficult to break free of that. We're surrounded by, I've just moved home, so I know how much stuff one accumulates, right? You may not be so radical as to give it all away, but try at the very least to make sure that you don't become so attached to it that your focus is on the wrong things. So I think those are three of the things which I think are quite core.
What prompted you to go into this as a heathen?
Well, I just curiosity, simple as that. And so I've always maintained my interest in religion, and I've always maintained an interest in Christianity. And it seemed to me, it was parroted so often that Jesus was a great moral teacher, even if he wasn't the Son of God. And I just really I wasn't aware of someone who had sort of examined that claim in the way I wanted to examine it. Okay, so I just wanted to do that curiosity.
We are out of time now, so just let me say once more that The Godless Gospel from Julian Baggini is a terrific reading. It's fascinating for fellow heathens like me, and I'm sure it'll be fascinating for people who have got a Christian belief as well, or indeed any belief system. So you can get it online from the Wigton Book Festival, and you can also donate by using one of the donate buttons online. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Ruth.